Maggie stood frozen on the festival stage, the scent of baked pies thick in the autumn air, as cruel laughter ripped through the crowd like a blade. The mayor's voice, heavy with mockery, echoed over the loudspeakers. "Hope the bench can handle both of 'em." And in that instant, the town of Red Hollow bared its ugliest face. Jack's hands trembled, not with fear, but with a rage that could either destroy him or set something far greater in motion. But what happened next would silence a town, shatter old hatred, and ignite a story no one would ever forget. But first, let's go back to the beginning. A shattered man in a shattered town, Jack Carter no longer walked. He drifted, his heavy boots dragging across the sun-scorched dirt roads of Red Hollow, as if the earth itself tried to swallow him back. The town, once lively with harvest festivals and Sunday dances, now seemed as broken as he was. Shuttered stores leaned against each other like drunks at closing time, their signs dangling by rusted nails. Even the church bell, once the voice of the town, had fallen silent years ago, leaving behind only a cracked tower and a memory of better days. Jack's broad shoulders, once proud from years of labor, now slumped beneath the invisible weight of grief. His arms, built by decades of swinging hammers and lifting beams, felt hollow, useful only to bury the woman he had sworn to protect. His face, weathered by the brutal Montana winds, bore a permanent look of exhaustion that no amount of sleep could erase. But sleep rarely came. Nights stretched endlessly, filled with the phantom scent of Emily's hair and the imagined sound of her laughter echoing down the hallway. Dreams, when they came, were cruel, replaying her final hours in agonizing detail, twisting the knife deeper each time. Inside the home they built together, a modest frame house with peeling blue shutters and a white swing she loved, everything remained untouched. Her apron still hung by the stove, dust now outlining its folds. The rocking chair by the fireplace creaked softly when the wind slipped through the cracks in the window frame, as if the house itself grieved her absence. Jack couldn't bring himself to move her things. He feared that if he did, even the faintest trace of her might vanish, and he would truly be alone. He no longer spoke unless forced. When neighbors greeted him, their voices overly bright, their smiles brittle with pity, he would nod once and move on, their words bouncing harmlessly off the fortress of his silence. They didn't understand. They couldn't. He had not merely lost a wife, he had lost his compass, his reason, the axis around which his life had quietly spun. Jack had convinced himself he didn't deserve a second chance. His guilt was meticulous, methodical, feeding on every what-if he could imagine. What if he had noticed her cough earlier? What if he had found better doctors? What if he had prayed harder? It didn't matter that everyone said it wasn't his fault. Logic meant nothing to a man shackled by his own heart. The only thing that made sense anymore was work, the repetitive hammering, the slicing of wood, the ache in his muscles at day's end. In the physical grind, there was no room for memories. In the exhaustion, there was no space for sorrow. He built sheds and mended fences like a man trying to stitch together a life that no longer fit him. And so, that morning, beneath a sky so low and gray it seemed to suffocate the town, Jack trudged toward nowhere in particular. The cold bit through his flannel jacket, threading icy fingers through the seams of his clothes. He pulled his cap lower against the wind, his breath a pale mist in the air. That was when he saw her, sitting alone at the forgotten train stop. A woman, hunched, her figure heavy set and trembling against the raw morning chill. Her suitcase, battered and scuffed, leaned against the bench like a soldier too tired to stand. She didn't cry loudly. Her grief seeped from her in quiet waves, deeper and more brutal for its silence. Jack stopped. Not because he wanted to, not because he even thought about it. He simply couldn't move forward, because in that crumpled figure he recognized something. Not just sadness, not just loneliness, but that same terrible, choking grief that had swallowed him whole. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Jack Carter felt something stir within him. Something like recognition. Something like life. A crying woman no one wanted. The bench at the Red Hollow train stop had seen better days. Its wooden planks were split and splintered from decades of punishing sun and indifferent rains. Yet it bore the weight of Maggie Brooks without complaint, though the same could not be said of the world around her. She sat hunched forward, her arms wrapped tight around herself as if to hold in the heartbreak that threatened to tear her apart. Her dress, a pale yellow number chosen so carefully to look soft and hopeful, strained uncomfortably at the seams, betraying her every insecurity to the uncaring morning. Her tears fell not in sobs, but in a silent, endless stream, cutting rivers through the smeared foundation and mascara that she had painstakingly applied just hours before. Every stroke had been a prayer. Please let today be different. Please let someone finally see me. But prayers, Maggie had learned, were brittle things, and when they shattered, they cut deep. Her suitcase sat by her feet, cheap, scuffed, the fabric fraying at the corners, its contents a collection of small dreams packed with trembling hands. A few modest dresses, a worn photo album with gaps where hope had long since turned to resignation, and a battered paperback titled How to Win His Heart that she had never been brave enough to finish. She had traveled hundreds of miles across state lines, answering an ad in the back of a battered newspaper. Widower seeks kind-hearted woman for marriage. Must be willing to live in rural Montana. No prior experience necessary. It had sounded like fate whispering to her. It had sounded like rescue. Instead, when she stepped down from the train, heart pounding beneath the tight seams of her dress, she had seen the man's face twist the moment his eyes scanned her frame. No words were exchanged. Not at first. Just a long, cold stare, a short, cruel laugh, and the squeal of tires as he sped away, leaving dust, exhaust, and shattered dignity behind him. It was not the first rejection Maggie had endured. As a child, she had been the girl left unpicked for games, the girl who pretended not to hear the whispered jabs and muffled snickers. As a teenager, she had watched classmates find sweethearts and carve their initials into tree trunks while she lingered in the background like a shadow. Life had taught her early that being different, being large, being visible, was a sin the world rarely forgave. Yet, despite everything, Maggie had dared to dream of a home. A husband who would see her not as a burden, but as someone to build a life with. Children who would run into her arms without a second thought, a kitchen filled with noise and light, a porch swing where laughter would replace silence. That dream now lay crumpled at her feet, invisible and bleeding. She wiped at her eyes with the sleeve of her dress, only to smear the mess further. The sun climbed higher, unkind in its clarity, revealing every blotch, every tremble, every ounce of her exposed humiliation. Still, she sat there, unwilling or unable to move. There was nowhere left to go, no money for another ticket, no familiar faces to call upon. She was stranded in a place that did not know her name and did not want to. A broken woman on a broken bench in a broken town. Yet somewhere deep inside her, buried beneath the wreckage of 1,000 small heartbreaks, a tiny flame clung stubbornly to life. It said, "Maybe not today, but someday." And it was then, through the haze of her despair, that she became dimly aware of someone stopping nearby, a figure casting a long, hesitant shadow across the dust at her feet. She didn't look up. Not yet. Hope was a dangerous thing, and Maggie Brooks had already been burned too many times. Silent rescue. Jack Carter didn't pause to think. He simply moved, as if some part of him, the part that still remembered what it meant to be human, had finally stirred awake. The crunch of his boots across the gravel broke the stale silence of the station. Maggie flinched instinctively at the sound, her swollen eyes flickering upward for the briefest second before darting back down again, as though expecting another blow, another cruel word. Her fingers tightened around the frayed handle of her suitcase, a reflex born from years of disappointment, of instinctive self-defense. But Jack didn't speak. He didn't offer empty words or ask if she was all right, because he knew she wasn't. Anyone with eyes could see that. Words, he understood too well, were useless things when hearts were broken wide open. He simply reached out his hand. It was a carpenter's hand, broad, rough, lined with calluses from decades of labor. A hand meant for building things, fixing things, never delicate, never pretty. And now, trembling slightly from something deeper than fatigue, it hovered there in the brittle morning air, an offer without conditions, without expectations. Maggie blinked, startled. For a terrifying second, she thought she must be imagining it, a trick of grief, a cruel joke her mind played to cushion the humiliation. She lifted her gaze fully for the first time, locking eyes with the man standing before her. Jack's face was a study in quiet devastation. Deep lines carved into weathered skin spoke of long years spent wrestling with invisible battles. His gray eyes held a sorrow so vast and barren it seemed impossible to measure. But layered beneath the grief was something else, something astonishing in its rawness. A recognition, a silent understanding that needed no explanation, no apology. Maggie hesitated, her chest tightening painfully. Fear clawed at her ribs. What if this was another setup, another cruel spectacle at her expense? Yet the longer she stared into those worn, grieving eyes, the more the fear drained away, leaving only a hollow ache where distrust had lived for too long. With a small broken sob that barely escaped her throat, Maggie set her suitcase aside and placed her trembling hand into his. His fingers closed around hers. Not tight, not demanding, but steady, warm, real. It was the first time in what felt like forever that someone had touched her without flinching, without shrinking away. Jack gave no smile, spoke no promises. He simply turned and began to walk toward the battered old pickup truck parked a few yards away, their joined hands the only tether pulling her forward. Maggie followed, her legs unsteady beneath her, the hem of her dress brushing against her ankles in the rising wind. Not because she trusted him, not yet. Not because she believed in miracles, not anymore. But because some tiny, stubborn ember inside her, long buried under ash and sorrow, dared to flicker back to life. And in the silent grip of a grieving stranger, she felt, just for a moment, that maybe, just maybe, she hadn't been left entirely alone in the world after all. A town that mocked Red Hollow was the kind of place where nothing stayed secret for long. News traveled faster than trains, carried by sharp tongues and sharper glances. Before the sun had fully set on the day Jack brought Maggie home, the whispers had already begun to weave themselves into the fabric of the town like burrs under a horse's saddle. "They say he found her off the train like a stray dog," muttered Mrs. Cooper behind the counter at the general store, her voice sticky with disdain. "A cow!" someone else sneered by the post office, the words slicing through the chilly evening air with cruel precision. "Dragged in a damn cow." Jack heard the whispers, of course, though he gave no sign. Years of grief had made him a man slow to anger and even slower to explain himself. But Maggie, Maggie felt every poisoned word like a slap against her skin. The stares followed her wherever she went. At the market, at the tiny church she dared to enter one Sunday morning, at the gas station where the attendant pretended not to hear her soft request for a tank of gas. Their gazes weren't curious. They were dissecting, weighing her, finding her wanting. She tried to shrink herself, stoop her shoulders, fold into the smallest possible version of herself, but it only made the scrutiny worse. Shame wrapped itself around her like a second skin, raw and suffocating. She barely slept, flinching at every creak of the old floorboards, every rustle of wind against the window pane. In the dark, she lay awake listening to the heartbeat of a house that wasn't yet home. On the second night, long after Jack had gone to bed, Maggie made her decision. With trembling hands, she packed her few possessions into the battered suitcase that had carried her here. Every brush of fabric against fabric sounded like a scream in the stillness. Tears blurred her vision as she stuffed the last of her belongings into the bag. She could not, would not, be the anchor that pulled Jack down. He had taken enough hurt already. The front door creaked when she eased it open. The night outside was black and cold, the stars hidden behind a thick shroud of cloud. She hesitated for a moment on the threshold, the chill biting into her skin, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might wake the whole town. And then a voice broke the silence. "Don't," Jack said, his words rough as gravel, cracking in the middle like an old branch under strain. Maggie turned, startled, the suitcase slipping from her numb fingers. Jack stood there in the dim hallway, barefoot, wearing a flannel shirt half-buttoned, and a face carved with more sorrow than she could bear to see. He looked at her the way a drowning man might look at a lifeboat slipping away. "If you leave now," he said, his voice ragged, almost a whisper, "they'll have won." He swallowed hard, as if each word cost him blood. "And I can't lose someone else." For a long, shuddering moment, neither of them moved. Then, without understanding how or why, Maggie found herself stepping back inside, the suitcase forgotten at her feet, the door closing softly behind her with a final, tender click. In the brutal silence that followed, something fragile, something stubborn, planted its first trembling roots between them. Growing roots, life did not change in a sweeping, cinematic moment for Jack and Maggie. It shifted slowly, imperceptibly, the way frost gives way to spring. Their days unfolded with the quiet rhythm of survival, modest, steady, determined. Pain was still there, lurking beneath the surface like an old wound that refused to fully close, but in the soft spaces between hurt and habit, something new began to take root. Jack, wordless as ever, showed Maggie the rough language of wood and nails. In the early mornings, he would hand her a block of pine, place a sheet of sandpaper into her hands, and guide her fingers until she understood the gentle patience it demanded. Maggie's palms blistered at first, the skin unaccustomed to the scrape and grind, but she never complained. She learned to steady her weight against a splintering fence post, to listen to the small sing-song hum of a well-driven nail, to trust the stubborn resilience hidden in her own hands. Side by side in the dusty workshop, they built birdhouses too crooked for sail and mended fences so badly bowed they looked like drunken soldiers. But each project was stitched together with something stronger than perfection. The slow, healing trust of two battered souls learning to exist side by side. Inside the house, Maggie worked her own quiet miracles. She scrubbed the windows until they remembered how to catch the light again. She ripped up the yellowed linoleum in the kitchen, uncovering warped floorboards beneath, and laughed, a raw, bright sound that startled Jack so badly he dropped a wrench. She cooked simple meals, often burning the first attempt but stubbornly trying again, filling the rooms with scents Jack hadn't realized he'd missed. Baking bread, roasting chicken, apple pie laced with too much cinnamon. And in the patch of stubborn dirt behind the house, Maggie planted a vegetable garden. It was no grand orchard, just a few struggling rows of tomatoes, squash, and carrots. Every morning, before the sun fully shook off the night, she knelt in the cool earth, her fingers tenderly coaxing life from the reluctant ground. Jack would watch her sometimes from the porch, a mug of lukewarm coffee in his hands, something unnameable stirring in his chest. They did not speak much of love. Words still felt too heavy, too dangerous, too easily broken. But it was there, woven into the quiet way Jack left a cup of coffee by Maggie's seat in the mornings, or the way Maggie mended the hole in Jack's old jacket without mentioning it. It grew with the stubborn persistence of the tomatoes Maggie tended, fragile, often battered by wind and weather, yet pushing upward anyway. Still, Red Hollow did not forget. The town's disdain clung to them like wood smoke. Jack's old friends, the men he had once drunk coffee and talked crops with, stopped waving when they passed on the road. Orders for repairs dried up, excuses mumbled and awkward. Maggie could feel it in every narrowed eye at the grocery store, every whispered conversation that broke apart when she walked by. Isolation wrapped around their little world like a tightening winter, cold, persistent, patient. But Jack and Maggie, stubborn as frostbitten roots, clung to the life they were making with bloodied hands and silent prayers. Because they knew, sometimes the most beautiful things grow where no one thinks to look. A cruel public humiliation. The harvest festival should have been a celebration, a day when the bruised and battered souls of Red Hollow gathered to remember that even a hard land could bear fruit if tended with enough sweat and stubbornness. Colorful banners whipped in the crisp autumn wind, and tables sagged under the weight of homemade jams, prize pumpkins, and steaming pies. Children darted between booths, clutching sticky candy apples, while old men leaned against fence posts, passing silent judgment over the younger generation's harvest. For a brief moment, Maggie allowed herself to believe she belonged. She clutched her carefully baked apple pie to her chest, golden crust still warm, the scent of cinnamon and sugar swirling around her like a shield, and followed Jack toward the contest tent. Her heart thudded wildly against her ribs, not with ambition, but with a fragile hope. That maybe, here, among pumpkins and hay bales, she could simply exist without ridicule. But Red Hollow did not forget. And it did not forgive. Mayor Curtis Yates, a man whose mouth had always been quicker than his mind, watched Maggie approach the stage, his beer-swollen gut quivering with anticipation. His voice, honed sharp over years of mockery disguised as small-town charm, cut through the crowd with cruel precision. "Hope the bench can handle both of 'em," he crowed, his laughter a shotgun blast in the chilly afternoon. The words hit Maggie like a slap across the face. Her hands tightened around the pie tin, knuckles whitening, the crust cracking faintly under her grip. Around her, laughter bloomed like a poisonous flower, rich and ugly. It wasn't just the young men with their too loud voices and too proud smirks. It was the mothers who turned away pretending not to hear, the older women who shook their heads and whispered behind cupped hands, the children who learned cruelty by watching their parents' grins. Jack felt the laughter dig into him like barbed wire, every chuckle a twisting blade against his already scarred soul. His fists clenched at his sides, the urge to drive them into Curtis Yates's smug face nearly overwhelming. His blood roared in his ears. Violence would have been easy, sweet even. But Jack Carter was a man rebuilt from broken pieces, and he knew too well that fists could not repair what hatred destroyed. Instead, he did the only thing that mattered. He stepped forward, reached for Maggie's trembling hand, and raised it high above their heads. The crowd faltered. Laughter choked into silence. Jack's voice, roughened with rage and love and a pain too deep for words, tore through the air like a thunderclap. "This woman," he said, each syllable a blow struck true, "is worth more than every man here combined." The silence that followed was not the silence of shame. Not yet. It was the silence of a mirror held up to every face in Red Hollow, forcing them to look and recoil. Maggie stood frozen, her pie forgotten, her heart pounding so violently it seemed the whole tent must surely hear it. Tears stung her eyes, but she held them back, clutching Jack's hand like a lifeline, feeling the unspoken truth hum between them. The world had tried to break them, and yet they stood together. An unexpected turn. Jack didn't glance back as he led Maggie from the square. His hand around hers was firm, anchoring her against the cold undertow of shame trying to drag her under. His shoulders, broad and battered, formed a wall between her and the weight of the town's judgment. Each step they took away from the laughter was an act of silent defiance, each footprint a quiet rebellion pressed into the dusty road. Behind them, the noise of the festival stumbled, caught in its own cruelty. Conversations died mid-sentence. Laughter strangled itself in the throats of those who had unleashed it so easily. The crowd stood frozen, the garish banners above them twisting in the stiffening wind like warning flags. And among the sea of faces, there were those who did not smile. Women, the ones who bore the silent burdens, the invisible griefs, watched the retreating pair with wide, unguarded eyes. A widow who had buried 2 sons in foreign wars. A mother whose boy had run away one night and never came back. A sister who had once stood humiliated at this same festival for daring to wear a dress sewn with her own trembling hands. Their faces, lined by hardship and heartbreak, softened not with pity, but with something far heavier, shame, turned inward. They had laughed once, too, perhaps at others, perhaps in smaller ways. They knew now the cost of it. In the days that followed, the consequences of Jack's defiance seeped through Red Hollow like thaw water cracking winter ice. The town didn't change because it wanted to. It changed because it could no longer pretend it hadn't seen the truth. It started with small, awkward acts. Mrs. Halpern appeared at Jack's shop the very next week, her gloved hands twisting a handkerchief as she asked for a rocking chair for her porch. She didn't mention that her own chair, still good and sturdy, had needed no replacement. She left without meeting Maggie's eyes, but pressed an extra $1 into Jack's calloused hand, her own trembling slightly in the transfer. Others followed. Tom Whitmore dragged a broken chicken coop to the workshop, his boots scuffing the dirt, his voice low and fumbling. He didn't need a new coop. What he needed was a way to say, "I was wrong," without slicing open his pride to do it. Neighbors who had once crossed the street to avoid Jack now paused by the fence, offering stilted greetings and hastily concocted reasons to stop by. A commission for a window frame, a request for a pie box. Birdhouses were bought in 2s and 3s, stuffed awkwardly into the backs of pickups and left forgotten on porches. None of them said the words outright. But Jack, who understood silence better than anyone, heard their meaning as clearly as if it had been shouted. "Forgive us. You showed us what we had forgotten how to see." It wasn't a tidal wave of change, nor a sudden flood of redemption. It was slower, harder, a painstaking mending of broken threads, woven knot by stubborn knot. And through it all, Jack and Maggie endured. Not because they sought the town's approval, not because they needed validation, but because what they had was real. It wasn't perfect. It bore scars, fresh and deep, It struggled under the weight of memory and the fresh sting of rejection. But it was a life built by their own battered hands, honest, stubborn, and stitched together with the kind of quiet love that no amount of cruelty could tear apart. And in a place like Red Hollow, where facades had long been mistaken for truth, that kind of life was rarer than gold and infinitely more precious. Redemption in full bloom. The porch creaked under Jack's boots as he leaned back in his chair, the wood worn smooth by countless evenings like this one. The sun had long since begun its slow descent behind the hills, bleeding the sky with colors no painter could ever capture. Dusky purples melted into molten golds, and in the hush between daylight and darkness, the world held its breath. Jack sat close to Maggie, their hands clasped together loosely, fingers entwined in the casual, unconscious way of two people who no longer needed words to bridge the spaces between them. Her thumb traced idle circles over the rough calluses of his palm, a motion so familiar it had become a part of his own breathing. Before them stretched their garden, wild, untamed, glorious. Tomato vines twisted and tangled over leaning trellises. Squash sprawled across the dirt with reckless abandon. Sunflowers tilted their heavy heads toward the last rays of light. It was no orderly patch of green, no showcase for neighbors or passing visitors. It was a living testament to resilience, messy, stubborn, beautiful. And beyond the fence, their grandchildren danced across the grass, jars in hand, chasing fireflies that blinked and flickered like tiny fallen stars. Their laughter rose into the cooling air, bright and clear, untouched by the sorrows that had once weighed down this land. Maggie's hair had silvered with the years, and the lines at the corners of her eyes deepened when she smiled, but Jack thought she had never looked more beautiful. In the fullness of time, the town had stopped seeing the roundness of her body as a mark of shame. They saw instead the fire in her spirit, the generosity of her hands, the strength of a woman who had taken a broken man and built something whole from the wreckage. They did not call her too fat anymore. They called her by other names now. The woman who always had a pie cooling on the windowsill. The woman who held your secrets without judgment. The woman who, without ever raising her voice, had taught Red Hollow what real love looked like. Jack squeezed her hand gently, his throat thick with memories too heavy for speaking. He thought back to that gray morning at the train station, the way she had looked, small and hurt and brave all at once. He remembered the moment he had reached out without knowing why, without understanding that in saving her, he was reaching for his own salvation. He hadn't rescued her that day, not truly. It had been Maggie, patient, stubborn, fiercely kind, who had pieced him back together, stitch by tender stitch, until he could breathe again. And now, in the golden twilight of a life neither of them had dared to dream, Jack Carter sat beside the woman who had rescued him from the darkest kind of loneliness and found that, after everything, the world could still be good. End.